What if I told you that every superhero you've ever seen, every flying, laser-shooting, bulletproof god walking around saving the world, was made in a lab, not born with powers, not struck by lightning, not bitten by a radioactive anything, just injected by a corporation that spent decades making sure you never found out? That substance has a name. It's called Compound V, and the story of how it was created, what it does, and what it eventually did to the world is honestly one of the most insane things you'll ever hear. Let's get into it. The origin. The story of Compound V begins long before superheroes became celebrities, long before Vault International turned heroes into movie stars, long before anyone had ever heard the names Homelander or the Seven. To find the beginning of it all, we have to go back to World War II. During the war, a scientist named Frederick Vault was working on a formula that could give human beings abilities far beyond anything that should have been possible. At the time, nobody was talking about superheroes. The idea itself sounded ridiculous, but Vault believed the human body could be pushed further than anyone imagined, and after years of research, experiments, and testing, he finally created something extraordinary. That creation was Compound V. Looking back, it's hard to overstate how important that moment was. But at the time, Compound V was still just an experiment. Nobody knew exactly what its future would look like, or how much influence it would eventually have over the world. As the war came to an end and Nazi Germany collapsed, Frederick Vault left the country and eventually found a new opportunity in the United States. More importantly, he brought his research with him. Compound V survived the war, and that meant its story was only beginning. The question now was simple. Could the formula actually work? Creating a compound in a laboratory is one thing. Proving that it can permanently change a human being is something else entirely. If Compound V failed at that stage, its story would have ended before it ever really began. Instead, the next breakthrough would prove that Frederick Vault had created something unlike anything the world had ever seen. And the first proof came from his wife, Clara Reisinger, the person who would later become known as Stormfront. First success. After Clara developed powers, Compound V was no longer just an experiment. Frederick Vault now had proof that his formula could permanently change a human being. What he had created wasn't a temporary effect or a laboratory curiosity. Compound V worked, and that discovery would eventually completely change the world. Over the years, research into the compound continued. More was learned about its effects, its limits, or if there even was one. Those answers would only come with time. The biggest challenge now was finding a way to use it on a much larger scale, because one successful recipient wasn't enough to build an industry, and the solution they eventually found would become one of the most closely guarded secrets in the company's history: the secret formula. Finding a way to create more superheroes became one of Vault's biggest priorities. The problem was that the formula still wasn't stable enough on adult human bodies. A fully grown person's biology fights it, rejects it, or metabolizes it in ways nobody could predict. Some subjects develop abilities, some develop nothing, and some develop things so wrong that Vault's team quietly buries the results and never speaks about them again. Only about 20% of adult recipients survived the process and came out with functioning powers. The other 80% didn't make it. The company needed a method that could produce superheroes again and again, and eventually it found one. Around 1952, one of Vault's researchers noticed something that changed absolutely everything. Compound V works completely differently on infants. A newborn body is still forming, and when you introduce Compound V into that process, it doesn't fight the system. It becomes the system, hardwires itself into the child's biology from the ground up, and the abilities that develop are stronger, more stable, and more powerful than anything the adult trials ever came close to producing. Vault now had a system. The company could create new generations of superheroes and carefully guide their rise to fame. Every hero who succeeded made Compound V more valuable, and every hero who became famous helped strengthen the illusion that powers were something people were born with. As more children grew up with abilities, superheroes slowly became part of everyday life. They appeared in commercials, magazines, movies, and news reports. Very few people saw the company working behind the curtain, shaping everything from the beginning. And the bigger the superhero industry became, the more valuable Compound V became with it. What started as a scientific discovery during World War II was now becoming the foundation of an entire business empire. Before long, some of those heroes would become household names, and no one across America represented that new era better than a man known as Soldier Boy. America's first heroes. People who had only seen extraordinary abilities in comic books were now watching them happen in real life. Among the earliest and most recognizable heroes was Soldier Boy. His popularity helped define an entire generation and made him one of the most famous people in the country, though he wasn't the only face of this new era. Heroes such as Bombsight, Torpedo, and others were also becoming known to the public as superheroes slowly established a place in America. Out of all of them, Soldier Boy stood above the rest. He fought in wars, appeared in countless public campaigns, and became the superhero that millions of Americans recognized instantly. To many people, he represented courage, strength, and most importantly, patriotism. His image became so closely tied to the idea of a superhero that for years, he was considered the gold standard that other heroes were measured against. But here's what the public didn't know. Soldier Boy's real name was Benjamin, and before Compound V turned him into a legend, he was a rich kid from South Philadelphia who flunked out of boarding school and couldn't get his father's approval no matter what he did. He volunteered to be injected with Compound V specifically to make his father proud, and then his father called him a cheater who took a shortcut, because a real man wouldn't have needed it. And while the public was focused on the heroes, very few people ever stopped to ask a simple question: who was deciding which heroes became famous? What they didn't know was that every public appearance, every crafted image, and every rising superstar could all be connected back to the same origin, Compound V, the blue liquid that Frederick Vought had created decades earlier. At this point, the company had something no competitor could match. It had superheroes, the trust of the public, and the secret behind both, which automatically handed them enormous amounts of power. The fall of a legend, the rise of something worse. Soldier Boy, also known as Benjamin, was the face of everything Vought had built, but behind closed doors, he was abusive and nearly impossible to control. He was sabotaging his own teammates' careers while leaving a trail of civilian casualties that Vaught's legal team spent years quietly erasing. By 1984, the company had already made its decision. In secret, a genetic sample had been collected from Soldier Boy back in 1980, enough to start creating his replacement. All that was left was to make him disappear. During a military operation, they finally got their chance. When a Soviet attack overwhelmed the mission, betrayed by his own teammates, Soldier Boy was drugged and handed over to the Russians. With full approval of Vought, the public was told that he died as a hero, sacrificing himself to stop a nuclear meltdown. He got a statue and a national day of mourning. While the world believed he was gone, Soldier Boy spent nearly 4 decades inside a Russian facility, where scientists repeatedly tested the limits of his durability in hopes of discovering a way to kill him. With Soldier Boy out of the picture, Vought shifted its attention towards the next project that had been quietly taking shape behind the scenes. Something stronger, more powerful, and far more dangerous than Soldier Boy had ever been. Compound V had already given the world its first superhero. Now it was about to give the world something it had never seen before. Homelander. The infant at the center of this experiment wasn't even given a real name. Inside Vaught's files, he was listed simply as Experiment Subject 1, a child created from Soldier Boy's genetic material and engineered from the literal moment of birth to become the most powerful superhuman ever produced. He was dosed with Compound V continuously, not once, not occasionally, but constantly, with the formula being adjusted and refined in real time as his body developed around it. He was built in a Vought laboratory, surrounded entirely by scientists and company employees. He was taught language, history, and how to perform emotions that would make other people comfortable around him, because Vought understood that the most powerful superhuman in the world also needed to be the most likable. He became extraordinarily good at that performance. He had to be. It was the only form of human interaction he had ever known. While Vaught's scientists tracked every physical milestone, they overlooked something far more important. Behind the extraordinary abilities was a child growing up completely alone, deprived of love, friendship, and any sense of normal human connection. The emotional wounds of that isolation continued to deepen, quietly shaping the person he would eventually become. By the time Vought was done with him, they had produced a product capable of flying, seeing through walls, wielding enough strength to overpower nearly anyone on Earth, and senses so powerful he could hear a heartbeat from a mile away. They had gone further than anything Compound V had ever produced. They dressed their greatest creation in red, blue, and white, gave him a flag, a name, Homelander, and introduced him as the world's greatest superhero, and the crowd believed every single word of it. At the same time, Vaught's research into Compound V was continuing behind the scenes. In a secret facility, scientists developed a temporary version called V24, better known as Temp V. For 24 hours, an ordinary person could gain powers comparable to a superhero. The problem was that the compound was highly unstable. The more it was used, the more damage it caused, eventually becoming lethal to the person taking it. The Fall. For decades, the system worked exactly as Vought designed it. Compound V kept being secretly administered to infants across the country, mixed into routine vaccinations while completely hidden from the parents who trusted the doctors giving it. The public kept buying merchandise, believing that the heroes they loved had been born this way. But then something happened that Vought had never fully planned for. The information got out. Every superhero the world had ever loved had been manufactured by a corporation that owned the formula and had been running the program in secret since the 1950s. The children who didn't survive the process were classified internally under a phrase that Vaught's legal team had invented specifically so the paperwork would never look like what it actually was: acceptable developmental variants. The moment that information reached the public, the fallout was immediate. The mythology that Vought had spent decades building started collapsing under the weight of what people now knew. And it wasn't just the public that turned. The very heroes that helped Vought build an empire were now becoming one of the company's greatest challenges. Homelander, the most powerful being on the planet, was never going to be told what to do forever. And on the other hand, Soldier Boy, the original hero, managed to emerge from the Soviet facility after nearly 4 decades and came back, carrying enough anger to settle a lifetime of scores. The system that Frederick Vought had built to last forever was cracking from every direction at once. What started as one man's obsession in a Nazi laboratory became the most carefully hidden secret in corporate history, quietly reshaping the entire world without a single person outside those walls ever consenting to it, and produced gods that nobody, not even the company that created them, could ever fully control. And the scariest part? The formula still exists.